You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. Good to see you, Geoff and Mike.
Good morning, or whatever time of day it is where you are.
Whatever it is.
Greetings from the West Coast here in Tofino
so
today.
Awesome. I love this satellite pod recording location you've got going.
We need to get out to Newfoundland and cover both extremities of the country here.
Oh, I like that. Pod goals. Well, okay. There's lots to talk about, so I'll get right into it. Later in the strategy suite, we're going to talk about the upcoming federal election, obviously. Geoff, you and I are going to have to do our best drum roll sounds for Mike.
Okay.
Yeah, because he's got an important announcement I think that listeners are going to be keen to hear. And we will be joined in the strategy suite by Caroline Elliott. She has a PhD in democratic theory from SFU and is well known in political circles. She's going to round us out for that, so that's going to be fun. Bring in a fourth. From there, we will segue, but is it really a segue, to the load of cash for BC infrastructure that seems to have tumbled off of the back of a truck, courtesy Canada's new Prime Minister. We'll get into transit funding, wastewater facility, LNG, apparently not a tunnel, according to Carla Qualtrough. We'll try and spend some time on Bill 7 and some other things. But first, I'm going to introduce our guest. It's our pleasure to welcome Allan Gregg. Simply put, Allan is a legend and a pioneer in Canadian polling and politics. He founded Decima Research in 1979, which was the dominant polling firm for its time, during which he was also the leading political pollster in Canada, helping guide the Progressive Conservative Party under Joe Clark and Brian Mulroney. He co-authored the book Contenders on the 1983 PC leadership race, which has been called, and I quote, the best political book you'll ever read by one of Hotel Pacifico's in-house reviewers. You can guess which one. For years, Allan was a regular panelist on CBC's At Issue panel and hosted a popular talk show on TVO in Ontario. He has received various awards, including induction into the Canadian Marketing Hall of Legends. Oh, and no biggie, he also helped discover the Tragically Hip and co-managed them as they leapt into stardom. So today he's principal at Earnscliffe Strategies. He's launched a podcast, Red-Tory, which you must listen to, and he's writing prodigiously on his Substack. The Hub, the Star, and other places too. Gosh, okay. Welcome to Hotel Pacifico, Allan.
Thank you very much for those kind words. I mean, if you ask my adult children, they'd say he's wildly overrated.
Well, that's, yeah. The adult children.
All kids say that about their parents.
Exactly.
It is the way. Yeah. It is the way. Well, speaking of age, can we start a little bit about, you're writing a ton. You're really prolific. You're out there a ton after being quiet for a while. And I wanted to ask what shifted for you that we're hearing so much from you now again.
Well, the quiet after a while, I mean, I was just literally growing tired of the sound of my own voice. I'd been doing the At Issue panel for decades, and the producer before we would ever go on air would say, be brief. And I would say, well, why? Because you've got to get to that piece about Squeaky the squirrel in Cape Breton Island, or how to get a cat out of a tree or something. You can't sustain for an hour. Why? And as you got older, you'd say, these problems are complex. They're not subject to 30-second sound bites. And in terms of public speaking, I had great remarks about, the changing face and mindset of Canadians and its implications for fill in the blank, Cornfield Cattlemen's Association. and so I just thought, let me just kind of ponder. And part of my pondering was I was going to do more long-form writing. And then I have all these colleagues like Bill Fox and Bob Lewis. I mean, really substantive individuals who spent, upwards of 3 years doing research. In Bob's instance, a history of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, and Bill's instance, what social media has done to the quality of journalism, and that for their efforts, they both got an invitation to speak at the Burlington Rotary Club. I mean, the books weren't even racked at Indigo. So, and then along came Donald Trump. And, I was saying to you guys earlier, I mean, the only good thing about getting older is you're supposed to get wiser. And I was sitting around saying, I've never felt as confused in my whole life. I mean, I simply do not understand the socio-political culture of North America, something I've monitored and tried to learn for my entire adult life. So I decided to start reaching out and talking to people who are in the field, and tried to get stimulated a little bit and understand what clearly is a chaotic and dysfunctional system right now.
Political parties have been under under pressure for quite a number of years. It's not just Trump. It's before Trump. We were seeing that in the UK, where Boris Johnson, led the Conservatives to a different political calculus, which has now fallen apart for them. We've seen Bernie Sanders and his brand of populism impact the Democrats in the U.S. Like the cohesive forces that maybe was keeping progressive Conservatives and then the Conservatives together and the Liberal Party of Canada together in BC are not the same forces that they used to be. What do you make of it? Like, what has been driving this change that it's upset how our institutions, which have been there for so long, have had to change and respond to?
Socio-political culture of North America is widely different now than it was 30 years ago. I mean, I remember reading Gad Horowitz's great book on conservatives, liberals, and New Democrats, and what were the dimensions of political ideology and political thought that created affinities to one of the other parties. And there were things like, hierarchy versus egalitarianism and progressivism versus traditionalism. And today, one of the biggest dimensions of political ideology is something that didn't exist 30 years ago, and that's optimism and pessimism. I mean, there was a dominant ethos since the Second World War that progress was normal. Next car was going to be faster, next house bigger, next paycheck fatter. And virtually everyone believed that. And so everyone was optimistic because tomorrow was always going to be better than today. Today, if you ask people in the next 2-3 years, do you expect things to be better off, the same, or they are now? It used to be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Today, it's only one quarter saying that things are going to get better, one quarter saying they're the same, and half saying they're going to fall behind. That's where the polarization is, not so much in ideology, but in lived experience. One quarter of the population saying I'm flourishing, one quarter of the population saying I'm treading water, and another half saying I'm falling behind. So that's where the polarization is. And out of that, you have a zero-sum society. If everything's going to be better, if you're doing well, that doesn't diminish my prospects of doing well myself, because wellness is infinite. All of a sudden, when it becomes limited, when you have something and I have nothing, all of a sudden you're my enemy. And so this is what we're seeing right now, tribalism. And to your point, Mike, I mean, the political parties have not adapted to this very well. I mean, political parties are there. I mean, the crucible of consensus, the grand aggregators, they were supposed to be there in order to overarch the interests of tribe, of identity, into something that was larger, to a larger end. And if anything, what they have done is they've accommodated that polarization. In fact, I mean, some of the research I've done it shows that, that people believe the political system is far more polarized than they are. And in fact, the people who feel most unrepresented in politics today aren't extremists. They're the people who describe themselves as being in the middle. So you've got a whole dynamic of things that have changed and evolved, and that we really haven't kept up with our understanding of those changes.
Well, is the MAGA movement solving a problem for the 50%, or is it for some other share? That's when you step back and look at Trump. It's not, do you see him as a unique individual who's somehow reshaping society, or is he speaking to a group that has a problem he thinks he can solve?
Well, the Magna Coalition is one of the things that confused me right off the top. I mean, how you get, Kansas farmers, ex-coal miners from Virginia, and billionaires from Silicon Valley, and Wall Street financiers all thinking they've got some kind of common interest that can be advanced by one guy is pretty phenomenal. That said, I do think at its essence, Trump does represent that 50%, the population who believes that they're falling behind, that no one represents them, that no one speaks for them. And that sense has been exacerbated by the center left, who've increasingly gravitated away from class-based politics to identity politics. And as a consequence, I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would roll over in his grave if he believed that blue-collar workers would vote Republican. And you've seen a little bit of that in Canada too. I mean, the reason Doug Ford gets reelected is he actually attracts blue-collar workers. I mean, if you looked at when Pierre Poilievre was really ascendant in the polls, he again had been able to really attract blue-collar workers who don't feel represented by the center left anymore. So I think at its root, the sense of falling behind is, and with what comes with that sense of falling behind is a nostalgia. If yesterday was better than tomorrow, then what I seek is yesterday, not tomorrow. And so I remember in the 2016 presidential election, the single best predictor of voting Trump or Clinton was not age or urban rural or white non-white. It was to the question, do you believe the best years are ahead of America or behind America? To which 80% of those who said ahead were voting Clinton, 80% who said they were voting Trump said they were behind. If you believe that and you seek nostalgia, I mean, what was the past like? Well, there were no transgender toilets there. Women were happily making cookies in the. There was hardly any non-white immigration previous to 1970, and so with that nostalgia, you get all of this kind of hearkening back to a bunch of things that many of us and many center-left people believe are retrograde and should be avoided rather than embraced.
Mm-hmm.
Building on that,
and just to finish that thought, and that causes even a further chasm. Thomas Rich wrote a book in 2004, 20 years ago. What's the matter with Kansas? When he went to Kansas, say, how can Kansas wheat farmers, vote Republican, for Christ's sake? I mean, it's completely against their own vested interests. And so we talked to them, and they said, well, you know why? This is because Democrats look down their nose at us. They'd rather hang out with Steven Spielberg and David Geffen than talk to me. They don't care
basket of deplorables.
Yeah. No, that is that instinct to actually deride the very people you need to get your support if you're actually going to form that kind of coalition of they want to move in one direction together.
Guess what's the weirdest thing you've asked AI? For me, it was about a tune I've had stuck in my head for close to 2 decades. I've been able to hum a tiny fraction of the chorus for years, but none of the lyrics that I heard once at a small concert venue in New Hampshire in 2002. Finally, in 2025, it occurred to me that AI could solve this mystery for me. My inputs were the venue, the year, and the fact that one of the band members played the bongos. And you know what? It worked. As AI gets more and more advanced, it needs massive computing power to do its magic. Which is why TELUS is launching Canada's leading sovereign AI factory in partnership with NVIDIA, starting with an inaugural facility in Quebec and a second site coming to BC. This powerful and secure facility will be a game changer for Canadian innovation, giving our businesses, institutions, and researchers access to state-of-the-art computing power to develop smarter AI products, boost homegrown innovation, and compete on the global stage. The best part? All of the data stays safe within our borders. As the first North American service provider to become an official NVIDIA Cloud partner, TELUS will be among the first to introduce NVIDIA's latest supercomputers in Canada. And because it's TELUS, these will be some of the most sustainable, AI-ready data centers in the world, using 99% renewable energy, natural cooling, and 75% lower water consumption compared to other traditional data centers. It's one more way the homegrown team is making BC a little happier. And Happier is also the name of a song that features the bongos that the band Guster played in a small venue in New Hampshire in 2002. It's pretty catchy. You should check it out. Fueling some of that disconnect between how people vote and sort of what they see, who they vote for and what solutions they're offering, is we just in BC had an election, a provincial election, where the prevailing winds were federal forces, right? And now we're moving into a federal election where the prevailing winds are really Trump and our neighbors to the south. So is this kind of the new norm that that the kind of prevailing winds, the influences, and the way voters are viewing who they're drawn to really come from outside, the issues and the kind of levers that are really at play at the ballot box?
Well, I mean, this circumstance is highly, highly unusual. I mean, a couple of old political maxims. One is one of the most successful strategies is find someone who's less popular than you to run against, who isn't on the ballot. So that's Donald Trump. And the other thing is find an issue and make it your issue. And so what we've seen is a tremendous shift in public concerns and public orientation. And the shift has been from kind of a focus on past grievances. We're not doing as well as we should. The cost of living is too high. Can't afford a home. I'm anxious about the economy, and these guys have presided over this mess that I'm wallowing in. To now a sense of uncertainty about the future. And with that has come a complete change in what people believe are the necessary skill sets and the kind of personality in order to manage that very, very different problem. And it's left, Pierre Poilievre just completely on his heels and put Mark Carney in a completely enviable situation. And again, Doug Ford kind of took advantage of this in exactly the same way, is that, his greatest strength all of a sudden became incumbency. I mean, when is that a strength in normal times? I mean, the other most effective campaign slogan ever written is "Time for a Change," and that was the ballot question three months ago. Today, the ballot question is who's best able to stand up to Donald Trump, and to that question, for the time being, Mark Carney is clearly winning, and as a consequence, you've seen an ascendancy in the polls, the likes that we've rarely ever seen before in modern history.
It's a shocking reversal of fortune compared to where we were on like December 16th when Chrystia Freeland resigned from cabinet, and it looked like it was going to be an absolute massacre for the Liberals. And then today, Mark Carney. Now, does that tell us that maybe, I mean, I was thinking that the Poilievre team had done a pretty admirable job of setting things up for an electoral win up until that point. And now that the polls have swung hard against them in the last month in particular, it makes me think, well, I guess voters weren't as tightly tethered to the Conservatives as I thought. Maybe it was just more about the option was terrible for them, but now a new option's come along, and okay, we're all going to run over here because we were really not that crazy about the Conservatives. What do you make of that churn? Because I don't think I can think of a precedent really in federal politics in the last, I mean, I know you've seen it in '93, but that was I think different. I see differences in terms of how fast that turned pretty fast. This was a couple of years of Poilievre really being dominant.
And he was tapping in absolutely to the predominant psyche, the public mood. And when he says Canada is broken, people were nodding their heads. Now you say Canada is broken, that's heresy. I mean, you're a bad Canadian all of a sudden. So the ground is completely shifted under him. But to your point, is you're right. The population had never particularly warmed up to Poilievre as a person. And so you could see his favorability ratings were never very good. Also, Canadian conservatism is very, very different than American conservatism, because there's an emphasis on collectivism. I mean, we may be the only country in the Western world where a conservative party will not try to open issues of gay marriage, abortion, capital punishment, or until very, very recently, immigration. Those are the cleavage issues. Those are the wedge issues for conservatives all throughout the Western world. You can't open them in Canada because Canadians are not conservative, social conservatives at all. So, in fact, I've often, when I worked for the Conservative Party, that I used to, my colleagues would say, how many seats are we going to win? And I'd say, well, maybe we should start by counting up how many we can't win and kind of walk backwards, because there were just so many pockets, and it continues to be major pockets of resistance to conservative voting in this country. And that what it's coming down to right now is three broad constituencies: is blue collar workers, new Canadians predominantly who live in the suburbs, and interestingly, young people, who are far and away the least predictable of those three cohorts. And that it's almost become a prima facie prerequisite of winning that you're able to attract at least two of those three constituencies. And what we've seen in the last 2 months is that they have moved from the Conservative and NDP party over disproportionately to the Liberal Party.
Well, could you develop that thought a bit, because you know something about the conservative movement, and we see three key leaders now who actually don't get along very well, representing conservatism Ford, who's very successful, more of a centrist, I guess. I'll let you fill in the blanks. Then we have Poilievre, who's uncomfortably stuck between Ford and then Danielle Smith, who appears to be giving campaign advice to the Trump administration. Isn't that a really almost insurmountable problem for Poilievre on its own, that those three currents are there and have their own social base?
Yeah, I mean, Doug Ford is kind of too busy to help him out, and Daniel Smith doesn't seem to know how to help him out. So it is, and it is the difference in those three political leaders. I mean, I guess points also to the kind of the lack of cohesiveness within the kind of broader conservative movement right now, which works at to their detriment. That all said, I'd followed Pierre Poilievre for years. Both was he was a backbencher and in Harper's cabinet, and never thought much of him. I just thought he was a pugilistic kind of attack dog who, could had a job in politics, couldn't get a job anywhere else, until he raised $6 million in the run up to the conservative leadership, which is more than more than Mark Carney, pardon the pun, or Mark Carney raised in this
Pat
current
Carney's
level.
spinning in her grave.
Exactly. And I said, I better look at this guy a little bit again. And so, as we all do, you went on YouTube and saw, among other things, he was giving a speech in a basketball court in Nanaimo High School, where he was standing on center court and all the other people were in the bleachers. And it was remarkable. It's a remarkable piece of political communications. And so I wouldn't, notwithstanding all those things I'm saying about, the headwinds that face conservatives almost inherently, I wouldn't write him off, because for all of Carney's strengths right now, Carney's strengths are not strengths of a great leader; they're strengths of a great manager, and he has not defined himself in personal terms at all. And when you ask, which one of the leaders is most likely to stand up to Donald Trump, he leads by a mile. Which one is the strongest? He leads by a mile. Which one can deal with the crisis situation? He leads by a mile. Which one cares about people like you? He doesn't lead at all. It's tied. And a third of the population have an answer to that. Which one shares your values? He doesn't lead there either. So if Poilievre can establish himself as someone who's more relatable than Mark Carney, then he's got a chance. I mean, what he's been robbed of is not just so much the boogeyman of Justin Trudeau, is he's been robbed of the past grievances. And that means attacking the Liberal record does not resonate at all right now. But that doesn't mean he's lost the present. While Canadians are concerned about the threat posed by the United States, they are also still overwhelmed by the cost of living. They're still concerned about economic uncertainty there. And if he can kind of tap in to the present and tap into people's personal problems, and Mark Carney fails to do that, this is still a race.
Guess another pop quiz from Fortis BC coming to you today. There's nothing more I like to talk about than science. Now that would be political science, but today I've got some real science, and you're going to have to reach way back to your high school chemistry class for this one. What is the chemical compound CH4 known as? CH4. Any of you know that? Because I know most of you are like me, probably spending more time in arts classes than science classes. But here's a hint. It means this compound has one carbon atom bonded to 4 hydrogen atoms, CH4. And what do you call that? The answer, methane. Or most folks call it natural gas. Now, next question. What would happen if we developed a process to separate those carbon atoms from the hydrogen atoms? Well, I personally don't have a clue, but the answer is you would have a process that produces low carbon hydrogen. And that's what our sponsor, Fortis BC, who does know a lot about this stuff, is working toward. Last year, Fortis BC began testing new technology at one of their sites in the Kootenays with the goal of bringing a large-scale hydrogen production facility to BC. The pilot project was enabled by funding from the province of BC's Clean BC Industry Fund and is a partnership between Fortis BC and the Hazer Group, an Australian technology firm. Referred to as the Hazer process, this new hydrogen technology uses a process known as pyrolysis to break apart natural gas into both hydrogen and solid carbon. The hydrogen can then be used in the existing gas system, while the solid carbon could be used in myriad commercial and industrial applications. and it is yet another example of how harnessing the strengths of the existing gas system will support the decarbonization objectives of FortisBC and the province. Innovative technologies such as the Hazer process have the potential to create new economic opportunities. With testing in the Kootenays now complete, FortisBC and Hazer are looking for a potential site in BC for a commercial-scale Hazer hydrogen plant. FortisBC, energy for a better BC and a better podcast.
One of the biggest points of contrast between them, I think, Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney, is when you corner Mark Carney on, if you question his rationale or you try and bring him a pointed question, he gets intellectually defensive, right? It's like, well, I'm smarter than you, right? Here, and let me tell you why. Versus Pierre Poilievre is one of the best I've seen for when he's cornered on that type of thing. It's like he chills and he goes like, it's like common sense vibes, right? Like, and he bites the apple. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, right. And I could see, now that the writ has dropped, that we're going to see a bit more of those two styles in contrast. And that is so much more favorable for Pierre Poilievre than it is for Mark Carney, right?
And you were jumping around here, but I mean, in a funny way, the guy who's actually flipped the question on Carney the most effectively in the early hours of this campaign is Jagmeet Singh. Where he says, this election is not about who can stand up for Donald Trump. This election is who can stand up for you. This guy, and what he's done also, by virtue of Carney moving to the middle, he's got way more space on the center left than he's ever had before, especially with Justin Trudeau in there, who's deemed to be on the center left side of the spectrum by most voters. And so he's got the opportunity also to position the Liberals and the Conservatives as Tweedledee and Tweedledum, the parties of big business, the parties of privilege, the parties that really don't understand people like you. And Mark Carney is a technocrat, is a central banker, is a guy who's the chairman of a fund that has $3 trillion in it, could get pushed into that mold pretty darn quick if, as you note, he does show himself to be a little arrogant, a little bit chippy, a little bit,
just a little. Yeah.
Don't.
But the NDP are historically low levels in the polls right now. Like, I think some of the public polling notes got them below 10%. In BC, they're as low as 12. So we're talking, wipeout. Now, campaigns matter. We got 4.5 weeks to go here. You've mentioned that the NDP do seem to have some territory between them and the Liberals that they could occupy. I'm wondering whether the NDP need a narrative that the Liberals are going to win and win big, and voters kind of gravitate to the NDP to ensure they've got some MPs that are going to speak to their issues, or something that kind of gives them an argument to get back in the game. Because right now it's they're got the worst of both worlds. If they're watching the Liberals eat their lunch, but they also they wear the record of supporting the Trudeau government for almost 4 years.
Well, I used to think strategic voting was a figment of academics' imaginations because I'd never seen it until 2015. And then what had also happened is the single biggest voting bloc in Canada forever were PC Liberal switchers. And this is what made the London, Ontarios and the suburbs of BC so competitive between those two parties. What has happened is that the distance between the Conservatives and Liberals have grown tremendously, while the distance between the Liberals and NDP has narrowed to almost nothing. And that, in fact, what we've seen is that the porousness between Liberal and NDP voting for the last 10 years is such that there's virtually not a Liberal in Canada who wouldn't vote NDP, or not an NDPer who would vote Liberal. And so when you get something like the 2015 election, for example, where the center left wanted Harper out, that was their principal motivation. And as soon as it became clear that Trudeau and the Liberals had a much better chance of doing that than the NDP, the gravitation of the NDP vote to the Liberals was phenomenal. Very good friend of mine's, Andrew Cash, who used to manage him when he's a musician, showed me polling that he had done in Davenport riding. He was 30 points ahead, had a 60-point recognition advantage, had approval rating of almost 70%, wiped out, did not make one scintilla of difference. And this is what's happening to Jagmeet Singh. right now. That said, I think Mark Carney does change the whole dynamic of his opportunity. What compounds it even in addition, though, however, is Pierre Poilievre, knowing he wants to get that blue collar voter, actually sees traditional NDP votes as something that he desires and is attainable. In fact, the only region in all of Canada I ever saw that historically where you had conservative NDP switchers was in British Columbia.
Well, Vancouver Island in particular,
and up the entire west coast.
interior.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, where you'd never see that before. So yeah, no, they look in very, very bad shape right now. That said, I mean, I've also noted earlier is, and I said, if these two, if the Liberal Party and the NDP Party aren't seen as being identical, why don't they just merge? I mean, that's the most effective way to keep the Conservatives out. But the irony of that advice is that there's tons of room on the center left in Canada. There's way more room for Jagmeet Singh to be very radical than he is right now, and not just to say we have to tax the billionaires. It's why are we paying hedge fund managers $6 million a year? We're paying freezing nurses' salaries for 3 years at $70,000. That's outrageous. Nurses should be paid $250,000 a year. Most people go right on. I completely agree with you.
But do you see a group of voters like business liberals, I'll call them, that Carney's probably attracting back from the Conservatives, that maybe prefer his experience over Poilievre? Like, how big is that group? I mean, because we've talked a lot about the blue collar voters on one side, but there's, managerial class, especially suburban area, affluent suburbs, perhaps, where maybe the Liberals and the Conservatives are fighting over a different type of voter there.
It's huge. It's the shortest answer. I mentioned earlier, I mean, a really interesting study that no one was interested in. And I asked people where they found themselves on the political spectrum. And then I asked where they saw the leaders on the political spectrum. And then I asked whether they approved or disapproved of the performance of the leaders. And what it showed us first is that there isn't much polarization in Canada. Only 13% described themselves either very left wing or very right wing. The plurality said, I'm in the middle. The people whose approval ratings were consistently in the net negative were people in the middle. People who were in the extreme felt they were very well represented. Extreme right loved Pierre Poilievre. Extreme left loved Jagmeet Singh, and even Justin Trudeau. People in the middle say, I don't like any of these guys. And that's because, you call them business liberals, the blue liberals and the red Tories, are the dominant ethos to this day in our political culture and completely unrepresented in the political spectrum. I mean, what was the difference between Paul Martin and Brian Mulroney? Give me a break.
Not much.
One had better suits than the other one, but that's it. There was nothing different between those two individuals whatsoever, and that has been vacated. And so one of the reasons, to your point, you say, well, Carney has not defined himself as a person. One of the reasons that he has been able to move the Liberals along, in addition to the external threat that obviously brings the skill sets that he represents into a higher salience, is the fact that he has moved towards the middle. That population that feels unrepresented by politics want a pragmatic, consensus building, kind of maybe even boring guy who can solve problems. And for the time being, Mark Carney looks like that guy.
But the question arises in my mind, and I agree with what you've said about the NDP, that and that class as a category in this election that it wasn't in previous ones. The near question is who can defend us against Trump? But isn't this follow-up question, what kind of a Canada do we want to have? Because up till now, we really have said we're not the United States, but we're not sure what we are. Is this a challenge for the leaders in this campaign, or is that the next campaign?
That's a very interesting question because there's no question. I mean, our sense of self-identity has changed tremendously. I mean, I've never seen, for example, in all the time I was doing politics, Quebecers say nicer things or admire being a Canadian. We always ask that question, do you think of yourself as an Albertan first or Canadian first? And, Quebecers are always seeing themselves as Quebecers first. I mean, and that's suppressed the BQ vote tremendously there and given Carney at least a temporary ascendancy in that province as well too. But what it's also done, to your question about what kind of country you want, it's forced political leadership and the business leadership in the country to address issues that kind of everyone knows that we should address if we want to build a stronger nation. But they're kind of too difficult. Quebec, do you really want us to build a pipeline to go, to New Brunswick? No, I don't. We're the most environmentally sensitive province in and what's in it for us? We don't have refineries here. Now, all of a sudden they're saying, well, maybe that's something we should actually entertain. I mean, interprovincial trade barriers. We've been talking about those for 35 years. And the thing that's, unrelated to so much the voters, but you're seeing that in terms of political leadership within the Western world right now, is that they've gone from kind of, this is heresy, this is frightening, this is scary, to we got to find a solution. And the solution means that we can't rely on these folks. We're going to have to do something very, very different. So you got Germany getting rid of their debt brake. You got France talking about its nuclear capabilities. So whether we can get past the short-termism of what's going to happen to Canada in the face of tariff threats, which probably aren't going to go away between now and April 28th, to those larger issues that Canadians seem to be much more ready to tackle with right now, is questionable.
Is there, I think we saw, was it this week? Losing track of the timeline, but I think we saw a bit maybe of Pierre Poilievre's team trying to change and use their own connections to change their juxtaposition relative to Trump. And I'm thinking of the kind of throwaway comment Trump made of, I'd rather have to stand up to that Carney guy than Pierre Poilievre. Is there a way for Pierre Poilievre to pivot that at all, that could play out in the next, especially if Trump's going to be so, who knows what he's going to do before the 28th? He'll probably still be the question. He's still the elephant in the room, but he could do a lot of different things. Can you see a world where that shifts dramatically?
Well, again, Poilievre seems to be stuck. He was so good at what he was doing before. He just seems loath to get rid of it. So even in that instance where Trump suggests he'd rather have a liberal, he's trying to use that to get at the liberal record. He wants a liberal because the liberals have weakened Canada such that they're vulnerable to America right now. Because he knows, incumbency in this particular environment is a huge advantage. If Mark Carney is smart, he's not running as the liberal leader of Canada. He's running as the prime minister of Canada. If it's like, Mark Carney, what did you do today? It's like, well, I went to Brandon and shook hands with a bunch of dairy farmers. It's, well, I talked to the president of Venezuela today about the prospect of a new free trade agreement. This is territory that Pierre Poilievre cannot compete on at all. He has no prospect, no ability, no platform to show that same kind of leadership. So as I said earlier, the leadership that he's got to show has to be much more empathetic. It has to be much more in tune with, I know you. I care about you. This other guy doesn't know you. He'll never know you. He would not want to hang out. One of the best proxies for leadership preference always been is, which of the political leaders would you rather have a beer with? And that's because people tend to personalize things. They don't make their decisions about political leadership based on kind of a rational calculation of performance or even skill sets. It is much more this sense of, are they like me, which is self-identification, and are they for me, which is self-interest, the intersection of those two things. And we talked about his ability to communicate politically. That's what he has to do. I think the notion of keeping the journalists off his bus and plane is crazy. But he completely discounts the power of legacy journalism, and he shouldn't, because he needs them now more than ever, because he's got to show that. He's also got a tremendously compelling origin story. It's just like, what? Really? You have to be a good person if you're married to that woman and have those beautiful children and have that kind of upbringing, and that you're still not kind of crazy. So there's lots there. Whether he can dig into that and kind of show himself to be, I know it sounds corny, a man of the people, a man who really does understand blue collar workers, who really does understand, as he talks about the 30-year-old who's relegated to his parents' basement with no prospect of home ownership. And you say, do you think Mark Carney understands that kid? And
Yeah.
that can resonate. That can cut through the kind of the concerned citizen syndrome. I am concerned about the things that are in the newspaper, as opposed to I'm concerned about the things that kind of really worry me as Allan.
Yeah.
Do you want to venture forth with a forecast here, Allan? Do you think, given the trajectory we are on right now, do you feel in your gut that it's just the Liberals are going to put more distance with the Conservatives and romp to victory, or are you feeling in your gut that we're going to see a tighter race and the Conservatives are going to get off the mat and make this a lot more competitive and maybe even prevail at the end?
Yeah, smart manager once told me, if you make a prediction, never put a date on it. The piece I'm written for the Toronto Star this week says, if you're a betting person and you wanted to wage on this election, my advice is to keep your money in your pocket for now. I cannot see a Liberal romp here. I mean, you got 57% of the population who still say I would either definitely or more or less want to see a change in government right now. While Carney's been able to distance himself from the Trudeau and Liberal legacy, he still represents that brand. You talked about Kim Campbell in 1993. There's no conclusion people reach with more conviction when they re-reach one they've already held. And for the last 2.5 years they've held, we have to change our governing party. If he has a misstep and kind of reinforces that sense, I could see their vote, crumbling very, very, very quickly. That said, I mean, this is one of the more interesting campaigns I've ever witnessed, because it's so unpredictable, and that the precedents are and antecedents are so unusual. So I wouldn't make any big prediction right now, but by the same token, I would not be surprised by virtually any outcome.
Most important election since '88, would you say?
Well, 88, again, one of the reasons I'm doing this Substack stuff, which is called Vanity and Learning, is I'm actually hoping on the batter part rather than focus on the former. Is, we went into the 1988 campaign and said, we do not want this campaign to be about free trade. That is the last thing we want this campaign to be. Turner in the debates was able to make it into free trade and put the Conservatives, on their butt for what could have been the rest of the campaign if we weren't very fleet of foot. But yeah, I mean, that it means that there probably is going to be 4 more years of Donald Trump and 4 more years who is ever our new prime minister, so that the table stakes will be set in this election for what's going to unfold over the next 4 years, and no one can predict that.
Oh gosh, I mean, yeah, I want to talk about free trade. I want to talk about, but we only have so much time, and I do want to come back to the tragically hip, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this though, because I think you talked a little bit about this moment and this kind of how it's evoking this question of this id of like, what's Canadian, what is it, and what's our identity, and how this Trump threat has played out differently in different provinces. Like, I just want to note, it's interesting, like Quebec kind of really quickly went like, okay, we don't want that. Alberta, a little bit different, right? A little bit more like, so I'm curious, like, and because I think the tragically hip is something that transcends those borders and in being a Canadian band. And I'm wondering, like, for you, was there a moment when you realized that the hip had become something quintessentially Canadian, that it was something bigger than just a really popular band?
Well, I mean, I experienced 2 things because I worked so closely with them. I mean, I had the frustration of bringing records to the record labels in the States and them saying, who is Bob Cajun anyway? I've never heard of that guy. Or Bill Barilko, who that? Tom Thompson came paddling. What are you guys singing about? I mean, they had no frame of reference to understand what was going on there. someone once, I think it was Sigmund Freud, who had actually coined the phrase, the narcissism of small differences, but someone used it to describe the nature of Canadian identity, that we look, somewhat enviously into the mirror of America and see ourselves, but define ourselves in terms of what small differences we see. And so if Americans are warlike, we are peaceful. If Americans are intolerant, we are tolerant. And I don't think there's any question, by virtue of sharing, a common culture, sharing, a relatively common ancestry, sharing a common language, sharing a common continent, that that juxtaposition provides part of the definition of who we are. That said, that doesn't make the sense any less real at an emotional level. I mean, when Tragedy Hip did their last show, 11 million people watched that. There's hardly 11 million households in Canada. You just don't see that phenomenon. And they spoke by virtue of talking about Bill Barilko, by virtue of talking about Tom Thompson, saying, not only is there nothing the matter with being Canadian, there's all kinds of good stuff to being Canadian. And then they actually lived that life in addition by saying, they did not work America the way they work Canada. That it bugged them that people always said, why aren't you as big in the States as here? But it never bugged them that they weren't. The question bugged them. The very fact that they weren't really never bothered them at all. Maybe they made a lot of overt decisions over the course of their career that hurt them in the United States, and they did that knowing that it would hurt them in the United States, because they just were not prepared to do the un-Canadian thing. I mean, the documentary talks about them having this tremendous opportunity to get front racked in Towers Records if they played in their facilities. And they said, well, no, we're not turning our back on Sam the Record Man. Sam the Record Man is Canadian competition to Towers. And the head of the label, Randy Lennox, the palm of his hand just went right onto the top of his forehead. He just, I don't understand you knuckleheads. And the unstated answer to his not understanding is, we're Canadians.
Funny, what a perfect moment as we're all eating our Hawkins and enjoying our Canadian brands in general. What a perfect place to bring the conversation to a close. I want to thank you, Allan, for joining us. It was such a pleasure.
Oh, listen, the pleasure was all mine. Let's do it again.
Hello. You've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
Thanks for joining us today, Caroline, in the Strategy Suite. It's great to have you here.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Stranger in the gallery.
Look out.
First order of business, though, can I get a drum roll, please? Because we have an announcement. Mike McDonald, do you want to share with our listeners what's going on now that the writ has dropped?
Well, listeners, we're not going to do something crazy like we did in the provincial election where we went daily during the BC writ. We're going to do something a little different. Every Sunday, one Sunday a week for 5 weeks, I will do a drill down on BC's BC riding battles with our old friend Richard Zussman from Global TV. So Richard and I are going to break region by region, week by week, and then wrap it all up at the end with the hottest races. It'll be a half an hour little.
Do you get to use Richard's giant iPad?
Do you
I
get
get
the
to
map?
use the map? No, you know what? Maybe we should. But he did. I did a hit for Focus BC last week, and he let me touch the map, and I got a little press the button, and it all expanded like that. So that was highly exciting for me. So
that map looks so satisfying. I feel like whatever we can do, yeah.
They have to update it though. They got the old results in it, so some little worker bee at Global's better get moving on it.
All right. Well, let's zoom in on some ridings now, but just let's talk about some of the who's in, who's out, because I think we've had pretty fresh some announcements. Christy's not running, Mike? She's out this year.
Christy is not running, and Gregor Robertson is. So
in the new riding, right? In
Yeah, it's
Fraserview,
Lake.
Burnaby South.
Vancouver,
it.
Fraser, Burnaby, South Burnaby, yeah, something like that, which is basically the old Vancouver South plus a little bit of South Burnaby. Um, yeah, I mean, a lot has happened with candidate nominations for all parties in the last week, but the Liberals especially,
It's a
obviously
different context.
they
Yeah.
knew what their election timing was, so they knew what they had to do. But they short-circuited a nomination battle in Vancouver Quadra, and four candidates have been, at least four, had been campaigning for the nomination for quite some time, and they just, we don't need to hold a meeting. We're going with Wade Grant. So, and two fairly strong, at least two, anyways, that I'm aware of. Women were running for the nomination who were just kind of left at the side of the road on that. And there's been some other choices the Liberals have made where they have appointed men and not really thought twice about it. And it's not 2015 anymore because a lot of like most of the candidates in Metro Vancouver that I've seen are male for the Liberals, and that has consequences. It may have consequences with voters. I'm not sure if it will or not. Depends who's going to make an issue out of it. But when it comes to choosing a cabinet later, if Mark Carney wins the election and forms a cabinet, he's already shown that he's not going to be beholden to the 50-50 rule because his cabinet is not balanced right now. But if it were, and they're only serving up men in BC, because I'm assuming Hetty Fry is not going to be in cabinet, then that either puts pressure on other regions to provide more women than men, or BC just doesn't get many ministers. And right now we only have one BC minister out of 24 in the federal cabinet. So I'm watching all that out of things as we go forward, just to see what does this really mean for British Columbia. So.
Right. And Caroline, so I think the Conservatives, I was looking this up earlier, are also pretty far along. I think they've got 30 candidates in BC so it's 43 out of the 343 are in BC. I think they've got 30 with a good handful of incumbents too, like maybe more than the Liberals, which should be an advantage. There is an advantage mathematically coming into it. How are the nominations looking up for the Conservatives?
Well, I think you've got the numbers about right. I don't have the exact number, but that sounds right to me. I think they're facing a bit of a run for their money in some of the places where they've nominated candidates. I mean, just locally, I'm on the North Shore of Vancouver, so we've got 3 Liberal incumbent MPs where I think the discussion was about, okay, who can we put into some of these seats who can potentially be a voice at the cabinet table. And now that conversation has changed a lot to be saying, can we win these seats at all? Any of these 3 here. And so I know they're out there working hard and doing their thing, but it's a significant issue. You look to even to Surrey, where Christy Clark was rumored to be putting her hat in the ring in Surrey South, White Rock, whatever the exact riding name is, against Carrie Lynn Finlay. I think Christy Clark, as her opponent or not, and it's Ernie Klassen now, a former White Rock City Councillor. Carrie Lynn's going to be working hard for her seat, right? And that's not something that was really in the cards a month ago, even. Maybe a little bit further back than that. So it's pretty interesting to see it play out. I think that they do have some very strong candidates, but in other places, it's, the Mike DeYoung situation in Abbotsford where it does raise some questions, and you just kind of think, okay, like what is going on there? And there's not a lot of public information out there. My understanding is Mike DeYoung himself isn't sure what exactly the rationale was for the decision that was made and the Conservatives not allowing him to run.
Saying he wasn't qualified, right? And we just haven't heard what. How?
It's very
24 a 24-year-old young man was qualified to be nominated, but not Mike.
And I truly don't know the rationale behind that. I'm not in that inside loop where you would know that. Yeah. But I look at that and I think, okay, that's a riding where it's probably going to go Conservative, but not necessarily. Having the right candidate in the right place to win that seat should be critical. So it's just it's interesting to see it play out, and it hasn't all been uncontroversial. But then again, neither has it been on the Liberal side, with say Gregor Robertson coming in.
It has come to my attention that I, Gary, the AI-generated voice who shills for air quotes media, am not popular with our listeners on YouTube. Or should I say one listener goes by an alias of cutlery and soiled clothing. Well, suck it, Fork Laundry. This one's for you. Actually, Forky, it's a proposal for everybody, and you're gonna like it. Advertise on air quotes pods, and you can get my nauseating voice off the air. Because your message will be read by one of our influential and human hosts, David Hurley, Kate Hammer, or Mike McDonald. Or just record any piece of creative in your ad agency's fancy production studio and send it to us. Either way, you'll be reaching Canada's most influential listeners at this crucial intersection of politics, and who knows what the fuck happens next. Trump, a new prime minister, new economic policy, a whole new world order. Baby! My data points are tingling. Curse of Politics, the Hurly-Burly, and Hotel Pacifico have the ears of cabinet ministers, elected officials, and the political class, leading journalists, the C-suite, and tens of thousands of engaged Canadians. Prime influence time. So let's do Forky a solid. Email us at contact@airquotesmedia.com to get rid of Gary and get your message to the decision maker.
Well, speaking of actually, because there's the new seats in Kelowna, is that right? Mm-hmm. The one that got added to BC. Do we know? Is that one? What are the boundaries of that one?
It's probably conservative, although in the provincial election, who's the NDP candidate up there, Geoff?
Which one in Kelowna?
Kelowna Centre. He almost won. He's a Kelowna councillor. I can't remember
his name. Yeah.
I mean, the NDP almost won that core Kelowna seat provincially, which suggests a critical mass of progressive voters there. Yeah, the Liberals won Kelowna in 2015. And I think the riding has probably shrunk, like geographically, to, it's probably more that urban core of Kelowna is more of has more influence over that riding now. So I wouldn't rule out in a Liberal majority government, if that happened, that they sweep Kelowna in again.
Yeah.
I think it's possible.
So just I did a quick search, and it's that Kelowna Centre riding went for Christina Lowen, and she won against Loyal Woolridge, by like 40 votes.
Yeah,
I'm looking at it.
Yeah, but don't forget that also had Michael Humer running there as an independent with BC United. Or not BC United, former BC United candidate.
Sorry, what's that? What's BC United?
BC Liberals, you might have heard of them.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Political lore. So and Humer got 2,600 votes. So, fair. But again, it's a fair point. This new riding, I think, is going to be.
It seems like there's a pendulum swinging that if the Conservatives were on the ascendancy, the pendulum would swing into closer to Vancouver, right? It would they would start picking up seats in Surrey. They'd win Richmond. They'd win Delta. Come overland to the North Shore. I mean, that's if the pendulum was swinging that way. And if it swung hard the other way, then the Liberals are going back to a 2015 situation where they might win urbanized cities in the interior. They might creep further out into the Fraser Valley and might even tiptoe into Victoria if they got really lucky. So, I think I think what's different, Geoff, this time, at least at this moment in the campaign, is that it's such a two-way race in the polls. Like the NDP seemed very undervalued right now by the voters in terms of what their historic performance is, which would be at least 25% of the vote in BC, and they're about half of that in the polls right now.
Well, I'm with Caroline. I don't think the last word has been said on how this is going to unfold. And I also agree with Allan Gregg that Carney is not a natural kind of fit for someone who's a NDP-leaning voter. That if the space opens up and people feel safe enough about defeating Poilievre, they will gravitate back to the NDP. But also, I would say many of the NDP candidates, and half of the NDP federal caucus is here in BC, about half. This is a critical battleground for the NDP, and there's some real veterans like Don Davies, who are tremendous constituency workers and have very solid teams. Jenny Kwan, of course, is probably safe. There's a couple others, but there's people in that category who are strong and have good teams who will probably, are in very tough shape. because of the conservative wave. So I'd put Taylor Backrack in that category. North Island with Aaron Gunn. Aaron Gunn has been a rising personality on the right side of the political spectrum for some time. Rachel Blaney's not running again. So when I took a look at the numbers, I see trouble for a lot of the New Democrats on Vancouver Island, including Victoria, which was never really solid, even though it's been held by the NDP for quite some time. And another one that is interesting and maybe symptomatic of some of the discussions that Allan Gregg was tilting at was formerly my riding has changed now. I used to be in center with Hetty Fry. Now I'm not. I'm in Granville because we're in part of False Creek that shifts around.
We're in the same riding, Geoff. There we go.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But Avi Lewis is running for the federal NDP in center against Hetty Fry. And this, his candidacy recently had a rally on rent control, which is not a federal issue. This represents some of the issues I think that the NDP will have to reckon with no matter what the outcome is in this election, about where it sits on the spectrum, what kind of proposals it wants to make to British Columbians, and where it fits in this new emerging. And I think it's going to be long-lasting shakeout about people trying to identify their class alliances a bit differently. That's why the Conservatives are much more successful and overtly going to the trade union movement for support, which was unthinkable even 5 years ago. So, yeah, a very challenging time for the NDP, but I think given the success on the ground and the efficiency of the vote, we're going to see more than the polls would say at the moment.
I'm curious, just from your perspective, Geoff, how does this play out for the BC NDP? They obviously are affiliated with the federal NDP officially, whereas the BC Conservatives are not officially affiliated with the federal Conservatives. Now, the BC Conservatives are out there just 100% pro-Pierre messaging, anti-Trudeau messaging. It played a big part in their campaign, but it's going on through this election. The NDP have been a bit quiet. How does this work? They're obviously the governing party, so they're a bit more constrained. They want good relations with the winner, and the winner's not going to be the NDP. Jagmeet Singh's not going to be prime minister. So how does that work?
It's an important question. If you look across Canada at the provincial level, you'll see that the NDP's formed government or been in opposition in almost every province, except I counted last night 3 or 4, not Quebec, obviously, but formed government in Nova Scotia, as opposition or government in Western Canada. So a lot of voters out there are very comfortable voting with the NDP under certain circumstances. But there's been tension between the federal New Democrats and the BC New Democrats on questions like resource extraction, old growth. And when I was in the West Annex over in the legislature, there were many days when I was very frustrated to read what was coming from Ottawa in terms of that. And I think the question that Allan Gregg highlights about the shift between identitarian politics and class-oriented politics, in very broad categories, of course, is something that hasn't been resolved by the federal NDP the way it has by the provincial sections. So we will see. I don't think that it's a big problem for the BC NDP at the moment, but the election was so narrow here that we see the provincial wing hewing as close to the center as they can get, and some would say maybe even crossing the line sometimes. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out, I think. It's hard to see Peter Julian losing in Burnaby. It could happen, of course, but we'll see.
Well, if you go back, as I like to do, when the NDP were really on the ropes in the 90s federally, it was Sven Robinson and Nelson Rees who held on to their seats, who arguably were the two most prominent constituency MPs.
And very different politically.
Of that group. and not seats that profiled as safe NDP seats, like the underlying demographics. Like you would think Vancouver East would be saved before Kamloops and Sven's seat, which was Burnaby something back then. But they were so iconic in their ridings, they held on and withstood the wave. And, I think Peter Julian, Don Davies, and Jenny Kwan probably withstand what's coming. Bonita Zerillo, big trouble,
I think Laurel Collins of Victoria's on the bubble, but I would think Victoria would tilt towards her as opposed to towards a Conservative in that seat. I don't know. We'll see how it goes.
Well, maybe it's the Liberal opportunity there.
She'll have a green thread as well. The one I'd like to watch is Saanich and the Islands, which is a 3-way race between the Greens, the Conservatives, and the NDP. I was interested to see the NDP vote as strong there as a third, because It's been a while since it's been
Provincially,
held
you mean?
provincially. No, this is federally. It's a toss-up.
Oh, okay.
So Elizabeth May is there running yet again. Will she hold it? And if she's unable to, is that leave one Green Ontario MP or none? We'll see.
Yeah. I can't figure out these Green co-leaders. How does this work?
I don't know either. Yeah.
Who goes on the debate? Yeah, so, or I guess maybe she does English, he does French. I don't know.
Yeah, they tag team. Yeah.
Why do we
I
allow
can't think of
this?
anything nice to say, Mike, so I won't say anything else.
Well, yeah, we'll come back to this because I think the story of how this splits out, especially if the NDP numbers remain low, it sets BC up for being very interesting on election night, and the way this plays out differently, particularly in the Lower Mainland versus the island. So we'll come back to this. I want to talk a little bit about the money, the bucket of money that fell into BC over the last week or two. TransLink got some funding, $1.5 billion in capital over 10 years. There was the wastewater plant funding. I think that was $200 million. One that got some attention that I just want to spend some time on, maybe Geoff, you can speak to this, because it was Andy Yan, housing policy analyst, responding to the fact that the money for housing for the Greater Metro Vancouver Regional District came from the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund on the condition the regional body delayed implementation of higher development charges to the tune of almost that much, 220 million. So how is this not then it's like basically you got maybe a 30 million gift you're giving. Otherwise you're just saving developers from having to pay fees. Is that fair?
Well, by deferring the development charges to later in the process, you save them from having to finance that during the construction period. So that's where Andy Yan's comments comes from. But I think he's pointing at a much more profound problem, which is not really federal. Well, it is federal, I guess, at one level. There's no way that municipalities are going to be able to stump up the money from property tax to pay for massive projects that are required, like sewage treatment. Like, that's not a frill. So even with a provincial contribution, they're going to have trouble doing that. And so in each of these cases, you see Ottawa coming in with a share, for sewage treatment or for transit. But in no case does it actually solve the underlying problem for municipalities, which is that they don't have the financial chops, in my opinion, to close the deal. They have the operating charges to do. They don't have the capacity to deal with these global suppliers. So we see the collapse of the North Shore project for that reason, in my view. I want to say Massey Tunnel out loud here quickly, because I followed Mike in that. The story I heard, Mike, was that, so of course the news is saying that the feds offered hundreds of millions of dollars and the provincial government turned up its nose. What I think happened, and I haven't had a chance to check, is that it was below the bar that was usually set for that kind of strategic infrastructure on a main highway. And that's because the government that you worked for failed to ask for that before announcing it. So this was a bone that was poked at.
Yeah.
I'm just saying what I was told.
The government that preceded you would have completed the bridge by now, Geoff. We would have completed the bridge and probably saved $1 billion. So let's give me a participation medal for that one. There you go.
I think it wasn't it this time last year that that there was an event held at the completion of the George Massey Tunnel replacement project by the opposition at the time.
That's right.
And that was marking when it would have been completed. I think it was right around just early April or something. So we can mark that anniversary.
As a consequence of Geoff's rather hurtful revisionism, I am dispatching Councillor Dylan Kruger immediately to the Massey Tunnel for another press conference, decrying this outrage to the people.
It's too bad the tunnel's so widely supported, because that was what happened. Yeah. Anyway, that would the money left on the table seems to be there. The other one that cropped up, I don't know. I need a refresher on this one, Mike. Caroline, you may know because it's a North Shore thing too. The icebreaker. Now, this icebreaker has been a bone of contention for years with C-SPAN trying to get into the queue with the Quebec shipyard and the Halifax one. I'm not sure. Halifax had different boats. But finally, right on the eve of, Jonathan Wilkinson was able to announce that somehow the icebreaker was going to be built here after all. So that was another one of these ones like Massey Tunnel and so on that a saga goes on and on and on.
But I think they also gave a huge contract to Davie Shipyard in Quebec.
Yeah, they did. They added an
And
icebreaker to square the circle, I think.
and that procurement that BC was successful in, or C-SPAN was successful in around about 2011, 2012, was supposed to be for all this new generation of ships, along with the one in Halifax. But the Quebec shipyards, they never give up. They're always just going to go inside or outside the procurement process to use their muscle to get
No,
what they get.
if I can do a quick follow-up, I was amazed to hear Mark Carney talk about we're going to build submarines, we're going to build icebreakers, we're going to have destroyers. Like this is like a 10 to 15-year program at the billions and billions and billions of dollars from a guy who is going to make sure that we somehow get our budgetary balance back, I guess. So there's a lot of very interesting announcements going on.
Well, yeah, when you combine the Iona thing, the TransLink thing, the
LNG
shipyards
Cedar
things.
got 200
Yeah,
million. Yeah.
you look at the numbers and you think, my God, like this guy is not interested in balancing any budgets. This guy is interested in going on an even bigger spending spree than his predecessor, which doesn't leave us in a very good place. I'm all for the money coming to BC. Like if it's going to be spent, spend it here, of course. but the overall amount, scale, and scope is it's big.
He didn't take the Oprah show to Quebec and Ontario after that. I'm
sure
I don't know. Yeah, I probably did. No, fair point. Fair point. Well, it's interesting. I mean, to say too, I think, the LNG 200 million piece, I think there's some clear efforts for Mark Carney to shore up and say, oh, I'm not, what climate policy, just to cover himself there.
Well, what I think is interesting is that the LNG issue is not going away. There's supposed to be a second final investment decision by LNG Canada this year for second phase. One of the major customers is China, which is also in a tariff battle with us. And, there's a lot of very difficult politics there for the new prime minister, whoever that is, to sort through the very antagonistic relations we have with China and the fact that China remains a colossal customer for BC exports. And I'll be very interested to see how that works out. So Cedar has already sold its throughput, but there's supposed to be more,
Yeah.
Yeah, the Cedar project is a bit of a layup at this point, and through a lot of great work by the Haisla. But what's changed in the last month or two on the LNG front is that Trump is making an aggressive play to develop Alaska LNG, and that may have an impact on trading relationships with Asia as well, because he's going to be putting a full court press on Japan and Korea for Alaska LNG. And Canada's got a decision to make. Are we just gonna sit on the sidelines and watch Alaska LNG be developed and forego our opportunity and watch our natural gas be shipped to the U.S. Gulf Coast for them to liquefy it down there as well, or are we going to do something with it? Because we're not stopping emissions in LNG. Alaska's going to do it. Somebody else is going to do it. We can do it better than anybody else, but we have to decide we're going to do it. So to be continued.
It does raise the question, though, when I look at like a $200 million investment in Cedar LNG, which, again, I'd rather the money be spent here than elsewhere, of course. But, is the answer taxpayer subsidies in that form, or is the answer getting government out of the way and reducing the absolutely onerous environmental assessment, permitting, consultation? You want to do things responsibly with the right amount of consultation and all those kinds of things. But the philosophical part of me that says I'd rather government be out of the way rather than taking money from taxpayers and subsidizing projects is another part of my perspective on that. But on the LNG phase 2, Canada LNG, like that's a thing where you can draw it right back to the BC government too, right? Because the reason that's kind of, my understanding is the reason that's sort of undecided or sitting on the sidelines right now is because of the Clean BC targets that require it to be, electrically driven, right? And if BC was
I'm not
like
clear
as
on that,
opposed to
Geoff.
gas, I don't
Not
know.
quite. I think your fundamental point's correct, Caroline, but on that case, they said we will get there by 2050, but we need some time to get electrification happening. So they acknowledge the targets, but they can't come within them. And that's why I think your core point is correct, that future any future construction, including phase 2, is going to run into that target. And LNG Canada had a strategy for that, which hasn't been adopted yet.
Phase 2 has regulatory approvals, though, at this point.
Yeah, no, they can go ahead. That's settled.
But it's not. But is it true that it's not financially feasible without some reduction in those requirements that might allow gas-fired?
Well, they need permission to be later than the government might like in a perfect world on getting to the target.
Okay,
but they don't have to. They have, I think, a power move in hand because they're permitted, as Mike says. So,
yeah.
But you're pointing to a question, and so is Mike, that New Democrats generally have to discuss and face. And this gets to your question about the provincial NDP and the federal NDP, which just hates fossil fuels and has up till now, and supported all the opposition to it and so on. But provincially, phase 1 is theirs. The second phase was not within the goals, although there was supposed to be a process to get out of it. The question is, as Mike puts it, are we now in a position where we will turn our back on this whole process, given the difficulties, or will we pursue it because of all the upsides that are there for BC, despite the problem with the Clean BC targets? It's a big, big debate. It's going to be an issue for this government in the next, I think, 12 months.
All right, shorter term issue. Let's turn to Bill 7. And especially having Caroline here today, I think you're the perfect person.
We've got a specialist of democratic process. So that's
exactly. So just refresher for listeners, right? This is the bill that dropped just before the March break, and it's supposed to be sort of like emergency powers to help the government, provincial government, deal with the tariff threats from the U.S. So early on, I think we had the Conservatives out of the gate saying this is tyranny. The Greens asking for amendments, but now I think what's different, and I'm curious, Caroline, like we're seeing the business community really come out, and the Greater Vancouver Board of the Trade, I think, being the first to say, no, this is overreach. Like maybe aside from the interprovincial trade piece, like we're actually not okay with this. Do you think we're going to see more of that? And would you agree with that assessment? Is it overreach?
It's totally overreach. It's really from a nonpartisan democratic theory perspective, it's overreach. It's bypassing the duly elected legislature in the name of some emergency is very, very questionable. We're the only jurisdiction in Canada that is pursuing these kind of powers. I say we, meaning the David Eby government, which is not actually me. But I think the reality is, I actually think Gordon Campbell wrote this, and I think I'm attributing this to the right opinion column I read, where he said, look, like there's already blueprints for interprovincial trade barrier reduction or elimination. There's the U.S. Partnership Trade Agreement, where you can encourage other provinces to sign on. That's already signed by BC, Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, I think. You've got other jurisdictions putting similar bills on the table that do these things. Like, this is not something that requires emergency powers to do. David Eby can call back the legislature at any time and ask them to debate, measures that he deems essential to managing the impact of tariffs. So I think it's unnecessary. I think it's total overreach. I do think the government is blinking in the face of some opposition. I mean, originally he said, we'll go to an election on this. And there's been enough hay made of it by the Conservatives, by the business community, and by others that I think he's realizing, maybe I don't want to go to an election on this. But I really think he's overstepped, especially having formed government with the slimmest of majorities, to then say, I want absolute power for my cabinet. It's a little much.
Yeah, Geoff, do you think he's going to blink?
He did. I agree with Caroline on that. Yeah. I would say I gave this very qualified comments last time, a sitting ovation at best. Partly because, no one disagrees really with quick action to get rid of the interprovincial issues. That's not a big deal. And procurement is an internal matter, really, where the province could establish a policy, and it may be challenged in terms of existing treaties with the United States that are being trampled in other settings. So you could have that political discussion without a bill. There was the last one, though, is the catch-all category, the fourth area. Is sort of a catch-all category, which is leaving the government having to defend a hypothetical. If something really, really terrible happens that I can't explain to you right now, but I've thought about late at night when I was really worried, I'll have the power to deal with it. And I think that's where they're now saying, if you've got an idea for a guardrail, let us know. And it'll be interesting to see how creative or maybe passive aggressive the Conservative opposition is about dreaming up guardrails. I mean, they've got a pretty good piece of legislation to debate here for a long time, and the session is going to last until I think June. So I think we'll be hearing a lot more about this, and it'll be interesting to see how the government deals with this guardrail issue and how it tries to push it through, because it's very, very difficult to force through a bill with such a tiny majority on a matter of democratic principle in the eyes of the opposition. So I think we'll hear a lot more about Bill 7 before the session ends.
Do you see a workable guardrail, Mike?
Well, generally, I just think we need to put more onto the legislature to be involved in these issues. That's what I'd like the government to do. Now I sound like an old fuddy-dud here, as usual, but
Not to me,
I
Mike.
think at our peril, when governments take these types of actions and diminish the legislature and the role of the legislature, it's not good for us in the long term. And you can say the same federally, where the prorogation of Parliament will mean the Parliament will not have sat from basically December until by the time a new government gets sworn in and recalls the House, probably June, during the biggest crisis in U.S.-Canada relations in our lifetime, and Parliament is just not there. So again, we'll manage through it. We'll be fine in the moment, blah, blah, blah. But what do we got Parliament for? Like they got a job to do other than just be a rubber stamp.
Yeah.
So that's my those are my 2 cents, Kate.
All right, let's gather up all the old fuddy-duddy. What do we got government for? Let's all go grab a drink.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
Did you bring it? Did you?
Did you bring one, Caroline?
Are you prepared, Caroline?
Not exactly.
Okay, don't worry.
Okay.
I'll buy you time.
I'll
It's
go
all
first.
good. It's all good.
I'll go
Okay,
first. Geoff always goes first. I'm going to go first.
Okay.
I am going to raise a glass and take a shot. I'm going to raise a glass to the script writers in the Liberal Party of Canada's election campaign. Obviously, it's gone very well since Mark Carney ascended to the role of Prime Minister, as leader and then Prime Minister. And they have been filling the news cycle with the pictures and the images and the words that are working for their campaign. Now, that it may well be a time-limited opportunity, and sometimes the good ideas only go as far as 2 weeks out. But so far, so good if you're a Liberal scriptwriter. For the Conservative war room, I'll take a shot because they knew this guy was going to be elected, weeks and weeks before he became leader, and they cannot lay a glove on Mark Carney. And it's like, what do they got? I mean, I'm not saying there's some secret love child somewhere, but is there not some storyline that makes him not look as good relative to you? Like maybe they're trying, maybe it's on deaf ears, maybe it's because they've antagonized the media so much that the earned media won't listen. But whatever it is, it's not working, and the Conservatives need to find a contrast pretty darn quick.
Okay. Technical note, Caroline, you don't have to do a shot and a glass. You can do one or the other, just so you know. Mike McDonald.
I'm drunk on the minibar, that's all.
Well, and I think Mike McDonald might be our worst offender for doing 2 most frequently. We try to limit to 1, but just so you know. I don't want you to. Yeah.
Good to know. Good to know.
Well, I'll just raise a glass quickly to someone who's now in the chair that Mike was in, and then I was in, and then a guy named Matt Smith was in. So it's Jim Rakowski, who's agreed now to be David Eby's chief of staff permanently. He's well respected in political circles. He did a senior political job for Rachel Notley, and he was chief of staff for some time to Carol James in opposition. So a very seasoned person and someone wise enough to know how difficult that job can be, but he's taken it on. So I wish him all the best, and good find for David Eby to have him there permanently.
Fantastic.
As crazy as a personal life decision that would be.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Tell them, leads you to fabulous courses like becoming a podcast host. So
that's right.
I'll let Jim know that's a possibility in his future. I will also raise a glass this week. I'm going to raise a glass for Justin McElroy, who's back from his round the globe trip. I heard his voice, back on the radio in my ears again, and just some perfect timing too. Like, so glad to have him back. And also he did, I think it was BC Today, did an episode just talking about his travels, which were just so lovely. He has this beautiful ability, Justin does, to observe things that are sort of quirky or weird and share them with a way that isn't condescending at all. I could listen to him all day. So I'm glad he's back. Welcome back, Justin. Caroline. Yeah, Caroline.
Oh, well, I didn't prepare for this, but I kind of want to do two. Could I copy Mike and do two?
Yes, you can. I didn't want you to feel pressured to do two. You're welcome.
No problem. I want to raise a glass to BC's business community, who I think has been quieter, not to criticize. I know they have a lot of competing values and things they try to do and engagement they try to maintain with this government. So, this is not a criticism, but I am raising a glass to them for finding it in themselves to voice serious criticism with Bill 7 and be very assertive in their critique of it. So I was pleased to see that. I hope they do more of it. And I hope it extends to them calling out other government policies that are concerning when it comes to their interests in creating jobs in BC. My shot is for Jagmeet Singh and the federal NDP, who announced that they were coming out of the gate with enormous momentum as they proceed to a potential collapse. It takes something special to do that, but I observed
nowhere to go but up, Caroline.
I observed it with amusement. It's momentum. It's just I'm not sure it's the kind they're looking for.
So what was the verb they were meant to use?
They said they are experiencing record-breaking momentum as they come out of the gate.
Well, they do have momentum,
and I mean it's true. It is maybe even record-breaking, but it's not the kind you want to brag about. So
may well be record-breaking.
Okay. Thanks for joining us at the mini bar. That was great. Caroline, thank you too for joining us for Strategy Suite 2. It's been great to have you on.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you for having me.
Also, just another shout out, Mike. Like, I am so, and I'm sure everyone is just so looking forward to listening to you and Richard. And I really hope you get to handle the map. So listeners, keep your ears out for that.
Be an imaginary map. Yeah.
An imaginary map. You know what? My kids are really good at drawing maps. I might be able to get something together for you.
Okay.
And we'll see what we can do. Okay, great. I also want to thank our guest, Allan Gregg, for joining us for a fantastic discussion. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS and Fortis BC. We will see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.
Check out time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.